The IMF and WTO, instruments of economic control and exploitation. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, WTO, have long been criticized for their roles in global economics. Critics argue that these institutions serve as tools of a powerful elite, aiming to dominate the economies and natural resources of the countries they target. This essay explores these criticisms, examining how the IMF and WTO are accused of deploying economic hitmen to coerce and manipulate national leaders, and how their practices have led to economic stagnation and dependency in developing nations. Additionally, it discusses how BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are seeking to distance themselves from these institutions. Economic hitmen and coercion. One of the most pointed critiques of the IMF and WTO involves the concept of economic hitmen. These individuals are alleged to pressure and manipulate national leaders into borrowing money from the IMF under the guise of economic assistance. This narrative suggests that the loans are not intended to help the recipient countries, but to serve the interests of foreign corporations and banks. Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, has been a vocal opponent of these practices. During Greece's financial crisis, Varoufakis resisted taking loans from the IMF, arguing that the conditions attached to these loans would harm Greece's economy. His opposition to the IMF's demands led to his eventual ouster from his position, highlighting the intense pressure exerted by these international financial institutions. The reality of IMF loans. IMF loans are often portrayed as beneficial to struggling economies. However, the reality is more complex and troubling. These loans rarely benefit the local economy directly. Instead, the funds are typically channeled to foreign banks and corporations, with strict conditions ensuring that these external entities, rather than the host nation, reap the benefits. This pattern of exploitation is not an isolated occurrence, but part of a broader strategy. The IMF and WTO are accused of using deceptive loan agreements to seize and manage the natural resources of borrowing countries. These agreements often favor Western corporate interests, leaving the local infrastructure and economy with little to no improvement. As a result, the intended development and growth are stifled, and the local population remains in a state of economic dependency. The broader critique. The criticisms of the IMF and WTO extend beyond individual loan agreements. These organizations are seen as perpetuating a systemic form of economic imperialism. By controlling and exploiting the natural resources of developing nations, they hinder genuine economic development and sustain global inequality. The funds provided under the pretense of aid are strategically directed away from local needs, ensuring that the economic benefits are funneled back to Western corporations. This approach creates a cycle of dependency, where developing nations are constantly in need of further loans and assistance, which in turn perpetuates their economic stagnation. The BRICS response. In response to the perceived exploitation by the IMF and WTO, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are actively seeking to distance themselves from these institutions. They have initiated several measures to reduce their reliance on the IMF and WTO, focusing instead on strengthening their own economic alliances and creating alternative financial structures. BRICS Development Bank, New Development Bank, NDB. The BRICS countries established the NDB to fund infrastructure and sustainable development projects within their member states and other emerging economies. This bank aims to offer loans without the stringent conditions typically imposed by the IMF, thereby providing a more supportive and less exploitative financial alternative. Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA. The CRA is a framework aimed at providing liquidity and precautionary instruments to member countries in the event of balance of payment crises. This arrangement is intended to reduce the BRICS nations' dependence on the IMF for emergency financial assistance. Bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. BRICS nations are increasingly engaging in bilateral and multilateral trade agreements among themselves and with other developing countries. These agreements aim to foster economic cooperation and reduce reliance on Western-dominated institutions like the WTO. Currency swap agreements. To further reduce dependency on Western financial systems, BRICS countries have implemented currency swap agreements. These agreements allow countries to exchange currencies and avoid using the US dollar as an intermediary, thus reducing exposure to Western financial influence. Conclusion. The IMF and WTO, rather than fostering global economic stability and growth, are criticized for perpetuating a form of economic imperialism. Their practices have led to a cycle of dependency and economic stagnation in developing nations, benefiting Western corporations at the expense of local economies. The accusations of deploying economic hitmen to coerce national leaders into unfavorable loan agreements highlight the coercive and manipulative tactics used to achieve these ends. Yanis Varoufakis's experience with the IMF during Greece's financial crisis serves as a stark reminder of the intense pressure these institutions can exert on national leaders. In response, the BRICS nations are charting a different path by establishing their own financial institutions and frameworks. Through initiatives like the New Development Bank, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, and various trade and currency agreements, BRICS countries are striving to create a more equitable and self-reliant economic system. By doing so, they aim to break free from the cycle of dependency imposed by the IMF and WTO, fostering genuine development and reducing global inequality.